Winslow Jones. The code game rules.
Okay, does everyone show live? Okay. My name is Gary Dunn.
I'm Marisol Cisneros.
Miranda Thornton.
Mikkel Price. Emma Barwick.
Okay, great. Okay, let's get started on the questions since there's several of them this week. Okay, number one, should we really teach that if you don't know what you are voting for, then you shouldn't vote?
I have a really strong opinion about this.
Go for it.
I do feel like we should potentially do that. I think a lot of people are in this day and age are very party biased or like anti-party, and so they're going to choose to vote for the third party no matter whoever that is. And I myself, as you might have seen in the post, feel very strongly about politics. We've all known that from this whole class, but I feel like as an educated voter, I wish that I was among a lot of other educated voters, because a lot of people say stuff on their social media and on their, like, in conversations that is completely opposite of what's actually being said or being done. And so I'm very passionate about being an educated voter, and I have very frequently said it on major voting years about, like, I don't care who you vote for as long as you're educated about the issues and what you're going to vote for. And so, like, I hate to say that I would I'd advocate for someone to not vote because they don't know the issues. I would more advocate for them to be educated rather than not vote. But I do see the value in being educated while we vote. Sorry, I'm going to try to keep the rest of my responses long, or short. Sorry.
Oh, that was fine. You're fine, Emma. We like to hear what everyone has to say, because I'm a little bit strong on this one too. But I don't know if anyone read what I put on. I just put it on Miranda's post because I, she was one to put it on. But anyway, I agree partly with this, but not completely. And let me say why. And I might read some of this just so I can get it straight, because it has some statements in it. I don't necessarily agree with the full statement. If you don't know what you're voting for, then you shouldn't vote. I think that this statement is backwards. And I think that the church would not necessarily support this particular statement, because the First Presidency said, we urge church members to register to vote, to study the issues and candidates carefully and prayerfully, and then vote for those they believe will most nearly carry out the ideas of good government. In fact, they're telling us to vote, but they're telling us that before we vote, that we need to study, just like Emma said, we need to study and learn the issues. I think it's sort of like one instance. I give two examples here. One, if we need to gain a testimony of the prophets, we need to study and pray. We don't just not gain a testimony of the prophets by not studying and praying, which happens if you don't study and pray, but it's so important to gain a testimony of the prophets that you do the work and you do it. Another example I give is about eating. We know that we're supposed to eat, but if we just eat without studying and eating good things, which some of us do often, then we eat bad stuff. But if we study and learn what to eat, then we're going to eat and eat good things. And so, but we're always going to eat. That's my point, is we should always vote, but we have to do the homework to do it. Anyway, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I understand that opinion. I do think, for me, I totally agree with teaching, basically, if you don't know anything, you shouldn't vote. I guess I have a lot to say, but first I want to real quick talk about how you just said about the eating thing. I think, yes, it is kind of like eating, and like you do have to study out and eat right to be healthy, but voting, it doesn't just affect you. I guess eating for the most part just affects you. Sometimes it affects your children or the people you live with, but most of the time it doesn't affect the world of what you eat. Voting like what we learned, if you vote bad, if most of the world votes bad, then you're going to get bad. You know, it's like if they don't know or understand what they're voting for, then I feel like they shouldn't vote. But really, I don't think we should teach if you're not informed, you shouldn't vote. I think we should do it in a positive way and actually teach.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying, yeah.
Be informed and then
And vote.
Yeah, like that's because like this question, should we really teach that if you don't know what you're voting for, then you shouldn't vote? That's a negative question. And I think we should just put it in a positive way and say, let's teach, be informed, and then vote, basically.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting how it, like, I think it was in the video that talked about not voting if you weren't informed, I think, maybe. But how it kind of talked about how voting, how it makes sense that those who aren't informed don't vote, because it does. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. And if you're super busy with work or just you have other things that you're worried about, like if you have the mentality, oh, like my one little vote won't affect much, then it makes sense that you wouldn't vote. But then I found it interesting that it said that then you kind of get a biased voting group, because it's those that are really strong about the issues at hand. And so you don't get a very like good array of voters, but just like the ones on this side and the ones on this side. You don't really get anything in the middle. So I think because of that, like, yeah, you should be informed, but I don't know, maybe also promoting that you should vote and you should get informed, even though it takes a lot of work.
Something that I definitely agree. I think something that stuck out to me. That's such like a hard question, because like you guys talked about, you guys covered a lot of the things, like how it's oh, sorry. It's so important to be informed, but then at the same time, like there's something about having the right to vote for people, even though they do it when they're uninformed, right? Sorry. So something that stuck out to me was kind of the whole idea of telling people they can't vote, and as a way to almost help people get motivated to know what's going on, you know, because people don't like to hear that, you know, like that, well, I have my right to vote, you know, kind of a thing. But making it like the way that he presented it, kind of a thing, in my mind I was thinking, you know, that's kind of a smart strategy to use if you want to get people to get more informed before they vote. So anyway, that was just a thought I had. But
I think it definitely would tell people or help people want to be more involved in voting if you tell them they can't vote, unless they're involved. I think they'll be like, oh yeah, well then I'm gonna get involved and get informed, and then I'm gonna vote, you know.
It's like reverse psychology. I really like that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, anything more on that one? Let's move forward. Now they're talking about the 2 videos on the girls. For number 2, I'd say several of these questions do, but the question is, do you think these girls were being sincere or just parroting back things their parents told them to say?
I can say I kind of felt like I feel like it's something they learned. The first girl was a little bit more, I mean, she was younger. She was a little more timid, you know, about it. But the second girl, was very obvious that, like, that was her personal belief. You could see her getting very passionate about it as she was sharing it. There were certain parts that she felt very strongly about. And so I felt like it definitely was something, obviously, you know, her parents taught her certain things and helped her to learn how to be informed and stuff like that. But I think that you could see that it was a part of who she was, in the way that she presented herself. So.
As a young girl who really was interested in politics and really, I grew up in my mom was very independent with her political stance. My dad was very democratic. And as someone that was raised in like everything was okay and you needed to make your own decisions, as a 13, 12-year-old girl, I did have a passion for politics and I did have my own views. And I think that because the second one did show so much passion, it makes sense that she's not parroting. Like, she feels the same way. And I know many other, like my niece is 7 years old, and I know that 7 is a little bit young, but she gets just as passionate, and she can have an actual debate with an adult person about the way she feels about politics. And I think that we need to consider, you know, their perspective. There's the one that are going to, you know, when I'm 80 years old, those people are going to be the ones that are in power, and I need to pay attention to what they want for their future too. And so while I agree that some of them may be parenting, we need to take into account what the ones that really do get passionate about, what their perspective is. I think that's important. So, yeah.
Well, I think they're probably very influenced by their parents or whoever their that is happening, because children will always be influenced by their parents, whether that's they have the same beliefs or political beliefs as their parents, or because of what their parents believe, they believe something different than that. So I think regardless, you can't ever run away from influence from those people that you're around the most. But since they are so young, it does make you wonder if their parents were kind of, I don't know, motivating them for like their purposes, to have like a child speak out against that. Because I could see how there could be like dishonesty in that, but I don't think, like, just from kind of like what you guys saying, how they were passionate when they were speaking about it, I feel like they were being sincere, but it does have potential for it to be corrupt.
Yeah, I think I was going to say something around that as well. It's like, as a child, I knew what I thought was right and what was wrong. And in my thoughts, maybe they were different than my parents. So who knows what those girls' parents really believe or what they think as well. Sometimes, yeah, it probably could be parroting back, but it also could be that the kids are total opposite views of what their parents, and they have such, I guess, high opinions about it that they're going to speak about it and basically stand up for it, even though maybe their parents don't stand up for those views as well.
Something that comes to my mind I had thought about was the whole idea of parroting. You know, that's kind of like their argument is that they parrot. Sorry guys, he's got a bubble in his tummy. But it could be argued both ways. Was what I wanted to say, is like people on the other end of the spectrum, their children could very much be parroting, you know, their beliefs. So it goes both ways. I feel like it's anyway.
I think this question actually goes with the next question also. So I sort of will comment on both of them, but because parroting and brainwashing may be sort of considered the same type of thing. Children always learn from their parents if they have parents to learn from. Let's put it that way. And hopefully they do. And these two girls obviously had a mother and a father. In fact, that's what they were talking about, is having a mother and father. So not only had they learned from their parents, they were also experiencing what they were talking about. So it wasn't just learning from their parents and speaking what their parents said. These girls had the experience of having parents and thinking about what would happen if they didn't have a mother and father. In fact, that was their main question. Which parent, if I didn't need a parent, which one of them would I get rid of? Would I get rid of my dad or would I get rid of my mom? I mean, that was their question. And they both realized in their minds, so this wasn't necessarily just something they learned, it was something that they felt and were experiencing, that they realized that they loved both their mother and father, and both their mother and father were valuable to them. And so they knew that as they were growing up, they were better off because they had a mother and a father. You know, I equate it to the gospel also. You know, some people say you shouldn't feed the gospel to your children as they're growing up. You should let them decide when they get to a certain age. You know, once they get 8 years old, then they can decide, even though you haven't taught. Well, they can't decide anything if you haven't taught them. If you haven't taught them the gospel, there's no decision to be made because they just won't do it. And so it's example of teaching the gospel. Yes, as children get older, they will have an opportunity, just like the gospel, to gain a testimony. They will have an opportunity to test out the values that they've been taught in their home, and some of them may change those values as they get older, or the thoughts or the things that they've learned. But I think it's very valuable to teach children, and like these parents obviously had taught these two girls, and they were speaking not only of experience, but the things their parents taught them. But I don't see anything wrong with that at all. That's my opinion. Anything else on, if someone wants to say something on the next question also, the brainwashing, because that's sort of the same thing, then you can say something on that one too. But I think that's sort of because brainwashed and parenting to me mean about the same thing. So no comments. If not, we'll move on to the next one because we're moving along here. How is this different coming from a child's perspective? Whoops, who's that?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What I was going to say was, I think we like to say like, oh, they're just being brainwashed by just like one certain idea. But I feel like in today's world, it's hard for children to only hear one voice. Like, yeah, parents may have a lot of influence, but children are exposed to media which has like a million voices. They're exposed to their peers at school, to their teachers. They have with their LDS, and they have church leaders, and they're exposed to all of these things. So I think even if you wanted to brainwash your child, you couldn't really, just because they're exposed to so much, and they'd be able to hear and learn about different things. And they have their agency. Regardless, they'll always be able to choose.
Okay, very good. The next question is, how is this different coming from a child's perspective rather than from adults' perspective?
I think as a child, you want that independence. You're searching to become independent and working on becoming independent. Like you're not quite an adult, but you always want to grow older. Like at least that's what I did as a child. I was just like, oh, I'm 7, I want to be 8, or oh, I'm this, I want to do this now. Like looking on for the next step. And so I think as a child, they say my voice should count as well. You know, like I think that I should have a choice in whether or not I have a mother and a father, which technically, yeah, as a baby, you don't have that choice. But I feel like kids should count and they should be considered. And I think that, I guess, those two girls were fighting for their voice, and they were fighting for their right to basically get that independence a little bit more and fight for what they knew, that what they thought was right, I guess.
So I just want to verify, as we're taking notes, we're answering question 4 currently. Is that correct?
Yeah, we went over 3 a little bit, but
Okay.
and you can.
Sorry. I just wanted to be sure. So I just wanted to add my 2 cents into that comment as well. It kind of ties in with what I said in the first, but you know, the policies that are being made in local, national, world laws are things that we're going to be dealing with for generations to come. And so I really think that we need to place value in our kids' perspective. I understand that the responsibility to vote shouldn't happen until we're 18 and we can logically think through, like that prefrontal cortex is developed enough that we can cognitively decide who to vote for. But I think we do need to, like, these are our children and they are the future, and so we should take into their perspective, especially if we know that they've been educated. You know, I just mentioned about how I thought it was so important to be an educated voter. If these children are being educated from a baseline, like nonpartisan, very like cut and dry information, if they're being educated from that and can form their own opinions about that as a child, why wouldn't we take that? Like, we send them to school for 13 years. This is why they're going to school, is to learn for themselves. And so I think that we should really value their opinion. That's just my thought, though.
I agree 100%. I think that for me, when I thought about it with kids, I feel like we need to have those opinions put in. Obviously, like you said, like the logical thinking isn't completely developed, so there's a reason, you know, obviously that the adults have to kind of make those decisions. But I think that the kids help us to keep things in perspective and reality. I feel like anybody who's had kids or raised kids knows, like, kids just have an ability to kind of put you in your place sometimes in as an adult, you know, like to make you, at least I know with my kids, sometimes they'll say something to me and it totally takes me off guard, and I'm like, okay, I'm not handling this situation the right way. And it kind of helps me realize, okay, what are we trying to achieve here, you know? And I have really young kids, you know, and so they totally just say things that they've heard, or, like, you know, things that I try to teach them about being nice or different things like that, you know. And it's interesting to see just how their logic works and stuff, and it keeps me oftentimes grounded, you know, where I need to be. And I think that that's a huge value that kids can bring to the table in these kind of bigger issues. I think definitely agree with you guys that it's important to include it. So
I think children are, as one of you said, are more innocent and without guile, meaning they generally don't try and lie to you in these types of instances. Then a statement ran through my mind. I don't know if it's a scripture or just a statement, and a child shall lead them. You know, if we listen to children, sometimes we can learn a lot from them. And in this situation, hopefully people learned from these children as they're speaking, because what they were saying was true. Any other comments, or should we move on? Okay. The next question: should children's views be considered in decisions regarding family policy? Why or why not?
I have a lot of passion about this one too. Sorry. So have anyone heard of the TV show called Escaping Polygamy? Okay, Miranda's judging me, and that's fine. But it's this show, and it's based out of Salt Lake City, Utah. It's the polygamous cult called the Order, or the Kingston Group, and they follow these 3 girls that are helping their siblings and their extended family escape from polygamy. And they had this episode that talked about the Utah laws against polygamy and their children with accountants for abuse. And there was one girl, her name's Jessica, she's the main girl on the show. She's the one that, like, she was literally running away from her dad while he was trying to beat her into a gas station when they called 911 to try and get her out of this home. But because the Utah laws are that you cannot take a minor child out of the home if there's no physical, or like if they, like, you can't always tell emotional abuse, right? So they put her back into the home of the parent who is abusing them. And that, in my mind, has always stayed with me about when we're asking our children to be in policy. Like, do we take into their consideration? Yes, we do take it into consideration, especially when it comes to abuse, and especially when it comes to these issues that we are somewhat oblivious to. Like, I was never abused as a child, but I know that there's people in this group that have been. So, like, we need to take into that account before we, like, just pass judgment on their parents and say because their parents know that they're fine, like, we need to watch our children. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. I think children should be involved because they are part of the family. It makes me think of how they, in the church, how they promote having family councils. And yeah, like as the parents, you kind of lead the council and you kind of discuss things over. But it's also really important to get like the thoughts and opinions of the children because they're affected by our decisions just as much, if not more. And so I think, yeah, overall, like adults will have like the overruling say, but they should definitely take into account what children say.
I think that for sure, I'm like totally an advocate for that. Like both of you had said, I don't know, for me, I could tell I didn't grow up in a very good home, and maybe it was an abusive home. And at 7 years old, I wrote my mom a letter telling her to divorce my dad because we would have been way better off if she would have just divorced him when I was 7 years old. And I knew that was the better option, but for some reason, like my mom saw it differently, and she didn't really take my voice into account, and it was kind of hard for me, and it kind of, in a way, made me resent my mom because she finally divorced my dad after I moved out at 18 years old, and I was just like, really? At 7 years old, I wanted you to divorce him, or I needed you. All of the kids needed you to divorce him, and then you finally get up the courage right when I move out. But anyway, it brings in a lot of resentment. Like for my mom, she didn't really think of me and my voice and listen to me and my needs. And so I think that's kind of how we're doing with kids, even with these political views. We're like, oh, you're too young to understand any of this, so we're not going to listen to you. You know, like just because they're 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old doesn't mean they're too young to understand these subjects. And I think that's one important thing to think about and remember, that just because they're so young doesn't mean they don't understand.
I definitely agree with you guys on that. Something that I really like how Marisol put it about like the family councils. Like it needs to be a combination of the both, I feel like, because I've seen on the other spectrum, you know, in our family where the child has gone and told, you know, people that they were being abused when they weren't, and all the other siblings being affected by that, right, and being separated from their parents, and because the teenager wasn't getting what they wanted, kind of a thing. Like, and that's like every state is different, right? Every state has their different laws of how they approach it and stuff. And so I think that's why it's so important that it becomes it's a two-way thing. Like it needs to be, both need to be involved, you know, and both need to be respected in the situation, the adult and the child, because those situations obviously are really, really those are hard situations, you know, to have to figure out, and you know, and they're also individual and stuff. And so that's something that I think it's so important. I really like that concept of making sure that it's both, and that children totally need to be included in the family policy making and things like that. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
I think it's also been taken to the extreme on the other side too, where I can't remember what lesson it was, where they were trying to take away parents' rights altogether and have like children be like the sole decision makers. So I don't think that's good either. Like children do have a voice, but they also need parents. So I think kind of like what you're saying, Mikkel, there needs to be the balance of the parents and the children together making these decisions.
That's right. And as these girls were talking about in their speeches, in this same-sex marriage debate, at Supreme Court level or whatever level, the children were really never considered by that at all. The rights of the children, it was just the adults' rights. They needed to have a relationship with another adult. It didn't matter that children might be involved or children might have problems because of all these changing of the marriage situation. And so there are a lot of cases in laws like that. Children's needs and wants aren't considered at all, and they definitely should be. I don't know if any of you have listened or read Chapter 7 of our book. It hasn't been required. In fact, it won't be required. Next week, we read Chapters 8 and 9, and they just sort of skip over 7. But as I'm driving around, I have it on Audible, and so I listen to it. And Chapter 7 talks about the victims, children being the victims of this same-sex marriage debate. And it's a really good chapter if you guys want to ever take time to do it. But children need to be considered and their rights considered also. Any other comments before we move on? Okay, next question. Do you think these individuals have prayerfully sought to study and understand the doctrine of the family? I think they're talking about the two girls. Were they talking about someone else, or what do you think?
I think they're talking about the girls.
Okay.
I know for sure one of the girls was from Utah, and she seemed like she was LDS, so I feel like she would have. I'm not sure about the younger girl, but I would think that if their parents had taught them about having a mom and a dad, they probably know about or have some sort of religion and some sort of prayer, which I would think that they would.
To me, obviously it's hard to say because, you don't know what they actually have studied themselves. But at the same time, I think, like what you said, Miranda, about like they obviously knew what they were talking about. Like she knew what she was talking about. And something that came to my mind was just that the fact that she put that together for herself and what her thoughts, of like, hey, what if I didn't have one of my parents? If I had to choose one of them, which one would I choose? Like these different thoughts that she had. I think that shows the way her parents have raised her, because to me, what I got from that was that she's been taught basically to think for herself, right? That they probably have talked about these issues in their home, and letting their kids be aware, like, hey, this is what's happening, in our country right now, and letting them kind of be aware of what it is. And obviously her mind kind of went to these issues of like, as a child, from a child's perspective, like, hey, like if I didn't have one of my parents, like what would that be like, and which one, and all those different things. So I think it just showed, that it did a lot come from her, because a lot of those thoughts were kind of her own, like as a child, of what you would think of. So that was something, I don't know, that I thought of.
Yeah, I just think that even if the one girl who was from Utah wasn't LDS, I think she had some Christian type of background, and the other girl probably did too. And of course, any Christian backgrounds or any religious backgrounds, there's prayer involved in those religions. And so, yeah, they probably did have some background in this way. No other comments? We'll move to the next question. I think we're moving subjects a little bit here because it says, which of these readings did you side with more and why? And I think they're talking about the reading by Sister Beck, Mothers Who Know, and then the response, What Women Know, that came back after Sister Beck gave her talk in conference. So I think that's what they're asking us about. Which of these readings did you side with more and why?
I don't know if I sided with one more than the other, but I did like the second one. It was just a different approach that I've like never heard before, when they talked about how we shouldn't look up to the 2000 stripling warriors in the way that we do. We're like, yes, they were raised by mothers and they were strong in faith, but they still killed people, and that we don't promote killing, like they were awesome and they were great, but I liked how they just responded like, we don't see pride in that story because they did have to kill people. Yes, they stood up for them and their families, and they basically fought for what they needed, but it was still killing children of God. And I never really thought of looking at that story that way, and it really, I guess, just touched me in some way that I did kind of like their response to that question. I liked both of them, and I don't know if I could side with one, but that's my comments on it.
I guess I can go next. For me, the What Women Know, is that what it was called? Anyway, that one made me very uncomfortable reading it, actually, if I'm perfectly honest, because of I feel like they took a lot of the world perspectives on things, because there was a lot of issues that they talked about that I'm sure if they had talked to her about, like, she would say, okay, yeah, you have individual cases. Of course there are mothers that have to work. Like, there's these different situations, that happen. Like, but what she was teaching was, she was trying to help us remember as women our roles, right? Like, because the world has pulled us so far and distracted us from that. And so I think that's why for me it was like, some of the things that they stated, I was kind of like, okay, but it's kind of taking those a little bit out of context, like, of what she said. And so I think that's why for me it was kind of, and I think the biggest reason that it was kind of like, oh, was that they were kind of like signing this document of like basically stating like, we don't agree with church doctrine necessarily. And whereas I think it's totally different talking, like you have your different experiences and opinions and things like that. But, to make a document that you are trying to sign and have people sign, it's kind of like you're saying we disagree, with these, that's what you're saying basically. And so I think that's why for me it was kind of like, I think that's probably where I felt most uncomfortable, was kind of like, okay, for me, the doctrine, like I get where the doctrine that she was talking about, and anyway, that was kind of just my personal feeling on it. But
Yeah, I felt like the second one where was just kind of like them trying to put their 2 cents on and interpret things. And I thought they made some good points on like women should have the opportunity to work, like if they need be, and like getting an education is obviously super important and all these things. Made it those like secular and more like worldly things were more important than being a mom and like having this upholding to those I guess, responsibilities or characteristics that the Lord has given us innately. So I thought they made good points. I just don't think they went about it in like maybe the best way. But I like Sister Beck. It's nice, warm, fuzzy. I know. So
I feel like, excuse me, I feel like there was like a spiritual side and then like my political side, because my spiritual side and my political side sometimes collide. But I did think that both of them had value and insight and could shape us to our own opinions. I think it was wise to have both of them taught in the same lesson, so that we could figure out how we felt about it. Unfortunately, I'm neutral because that's how I am. But I think that it was really smart that I could form my own opinions and think about this question and like, what do I really feel, and what do I really think about the issues at hand. But I also love Sister Beck, so like I love her. So I'm grateful that it was in the same, but I'm kind of neutral on this. I thought there was value to both readings.
I'm fairly strong on, really strong about Sister Beck's talk, which was given in general conference. And as one of the scriptures says, when they're speaking by the power of the Spirit, they're speaking the word of the Lord. So in my mind, her talk was the word of the Lord. That's my opinion. But anyway, the other people have opinions, and some of those opinions are good. And we always need to be tolerant of everyone's opinion. But they sort of, and this goes into some of the next questions, they sort of encapsulated in their positive statements, which some of them were good positive statements in what women know. Then they'd slip one statement in there that was not a good statement, like they'd say, we have the responsibility to choose how, when, and whether we become parents. Well, all of a sudden, that statement sort of is not a good statement if you're, a member of the church. Yeah, there are some people who don't have the opportunity to have children, and there's no fault in that at all. There's definitely not. But if they do have a choice and they choose not to do that, then I think, according to our standards, LDS standards, they're going to be accountable for that decision. And these women all of a sudden just said, no, we're not accountable to anyone but to ourselves. This is sort of the individual thing. We're individuals and they're not responsible to other people. It doesn't matter what's going to happen to children. It doesn't matter what the rest of society thinks. We're individuals and we can make that decision ourselves and it won't be any problem. And so I think they just sort of encapsulated some of those things into some of their good statements that were not good statements at all. And they were definitely opposing Sister Beck in the things that she said. That's why they originated this statement. Miranda, you're going to speak? You took off your microphone.
Oh, sorry. My computer was just dying and I had to grab my charger. So
Okay.
I just fumbled.
Anyway, we're sort of into the next question also, which is what do you think was the tone and intent of What Women Know article? I mean, what was their intent of this article? And we sort of talked about that a little bit. Are there any other statements or opinions that anyone has about what you thought their intent was for coming out and doing this? I mean, that maybe I just don't know it, and I had never heard this one before. In fact, I asked my wife, I said, so did you know that there was a response? I mean, this is like 7 or 8 years ago, that this speech took place. And I said, did you know that there was a negative response to what she said? And she said, no, I'd never heard of that before either. And so maybe we don't hear that every time there's negative responses to what some of the sisters and brethren, of course, in conference say. But that's the first time I'd ever heard that there was a negative comment to this talk.
I think when you say that, I think part of the reason maybe not being because I think like the issues that they do talk about in conference, obviously a lot of them are very very controversial, and so you get the negative responses, but usually not from the LDS community, right? Like you get it comes from outside of that, and so I think that's why this one was kind of surprising because I had never seen it before either, and it surprised me because it was LDS based, you know, like that was kind of what they were stating, you know, together in our different lives kind of a thing. And so yeah, I think that, you know, that made it a little more surprising in a way, you know, because we all love the gospel, you know. So love I mean there's a reason that we're members, so for each of us it's all different, but anyway.
Do you think this was like affiliated, like I don't know like time comparisons, but is this around the same time where that group came out wanting, like the group of women who wanted to get the priesthood? Is this that same time or is that sooner?
I think it was actually. Does anyone remember what year the talk was given?
What year did that thing come out?
2007. 2007, I think it was given.
The talk that you're...
So it was a couple years later. Kate, sorry, I always associate it with Kate Kelly.
What year was it?
She was about 2011, 2010-ish. So it was a couple years before.
Well, I'm sure that group just didn't come about that year, so it could have been a build-up to what happened. Let's put it that way.
Because those issues seem like they'd almost be like building blocks for like, oh, women shouldn't like have to, I don't know, be like contained in these roles, and then from there just kind of escalate to like, oh, now we want the priesthood kind of thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's kind of like what Gary was saying about how like a lot of the things that they said were good things, you know, when it comes to women and women needing those different things for sure. But then they would slip in like one little thing, you know, that was kind of like, okay, that's a little bit on the extreme side a little bit kind of a thing. And so it's something that I think a lot of people would have definitely, that you had a lot of people that signed it, you know, and stuff. And I'm sure that's why, like, they read it and there's a lot of things that you do agree with, right? I mean, it's kind of like what you guys were talking about, like it's hard to know, you know, to say, okay, which one when there are positive things listed in there, you know, like for sure. So yeah, Marisol, I'm sure that definitely could play a part in all of that.
I think that leads into the last question, and it's how it says, do you see any of these philosophies of men mingled with doctrine? If so, where? You definitely do see that there are good things, but then also like some little slips in there. But it also made me remember a few weeks ago in our studies about the United Nations and how they slip things in there too, and you're like, oh, these are all good things, but then bam, every mother has to work and they can't be in the home. They have to have daycares, you know, like it definitely, you do see the philosophies of men mingled with this doctrine that is good, which it does throw a lot of people off. Either the people don't see it in there, or they don't recognize it as a bad thing too, and that's hard too.
I've often sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and I think that's why it's so important for us to be informed and educated. That way, when those things do happen, we can discern between what really is pure in its form and what is kind of distorted. And so, because when you first hear it, you're like, oh wow, yeah, that sounds good, but like not until you look at it at a deeper level, you're like, wait a minute. So I think for that reason, this class has, I don't know, shown me the importance of being educated about, I guess, the issues.
Okay, I'm gonna go because that comment was perfect right before what I was gonna say, so thank you. I was just gonna say, like, I know that I've been the radical feminist of this group, or that's what it feels like. Although I'm clearly not a radical feminist, but like, you know, when the Kate Kelly thing was going around, it really made me question, like, do I really believe the things that I say that I believe? And it was a couple years after I had been through the temple, and for us women who have been through the temple, it was quite a surprise for me to go through the temple and receive those ordinances. And I honestly feel that if those women understood and were educated about their covenants that they made in the temple, they would not seek out the priesthood. And I think that when we become educated in our own religion, and then we view what feminism is like in our religion, I think it will change the world for the better, best. Like, I think that we need to be educated on the covenants that we make from the time we make them until the time they change us for the better people. So I really like that you stated that education. That's perfect.
Perfectly said, Emma. I agree totally with what you said. You did a good job, and that brings it all together. Unless there's someone else who wants to say something, I think we've talked about these things enough. And Emma, go ahead and summarize for us.
Okay, so no other comments, right? Okay. Okay, I'm just going to read through the questions while I do the summary as well. Okay, question number 1. Should we really teach that if we don't know what we're voting for, then we shouldn't vote? We feel that this statement is somewhat backwards, and maybe we should encourage being an educated voter rather than minimizing the importance of voting. Voting also affects the whole country, and we should be more concerned about how our vote will affect the whole nation or world rather than just ourselves. And we also feel like maybe if we tell people this, it might motivate them into becoming informed, or like a reverse psychology way to vote. Question number 2 asks, do you feel these girls were being sincere or just parroting back what their parents told them to say? The first one seemed quite influenced by her parents, but the second was questionable for us. From a personal experience, we feel like because there was such passion on the topic, that it could be taken as very sincere. Question number 3 is stating, in other words, the opposition would probably label them as brainwashed. Do you agree with that premise? Why or why not? Question 3 was somewhat covered in the above question, but one comment brought to light that the other socialization of the child, meaning that there's peer influences, school influences, religion influences. There's more than just the parents that are brainwashing their children. The socialization of the child because they are exposed to just more than one type of socialization. Question number 4 is asking, how does this differ coming from a child's perspective rather than an adult? We said we send our children to school for 13 years to try and have them be able to form their own opinions about life. Why wouldn't we at least listen to their perspective? We also understand that the cognitive development isn't fully intact until the age of 18, but it is important to understand their passion and their wants and needs too. Question number 5 is asking, should children's views be considered in decision making regarding family policy? Why or why not? We've essentially decided that they are affected by our decisions as much as we have been. Of course, we should take their advice and protect them as much as possible. But we also need to be wary of if someone is not telling the truth about abuse or other family policy issues. Question number 6. Do you think these individuals have prayerfully sought to study and understand the doctrine of the family? We would assume that they would have, but we're not quite sure about the extent of their prayerful preparation. One of them seemed to have been taught their own opinions and have made her own perspective about it, but again, we're just kind of unsure about their background history. Question number 7 is asking, which of these readings did you side with more and why? A few of us didn't know if we sided with one or the other, but we saw value in both and insight in both. What women know made some in groupmates uncomfortable, and that it had been taken out of context quite a bit. In the end, we love Sister Beck's talk, but we also appreciate everyone's different opinions. Question number 8, what did you think was the tone and intent of What Women Know article? We kind of agreed that the intent was to bring Sister Beck's talk into a political issue and make it a little bit so that we seemed like the oddballs that didn't understand what a woman's true role was. Question number 9 is, do we see any of these philosophies of men mingled with doctrine? If so, where? We all agreed that there is an element of philosophies of men mingled in these doctrines. We also decided that we also mentioned about the women who wanted the priesthood, and how we ended the conversation was that if a woman was really educated about the covenants that she makes in the temple, she probably wouldn't be seeking out the priesthood because she has the same blessings as anyone else in the church does. And if there's no other comments, we are done with our summary.
Okay, well, I'll stop the broadcast real quick.